We dug something up and can't put it back. Posted by Astoneyshore on our no sleep. I've kept my silence for almost 6 months, but I feel I need to record the events that occurred in late June of 2014. Part of this is driven by an infantile craving for comfort, and part of this is fear that no accurate record will exist for posterity. What happened back then has caught up with me. I fear that my physical journal may not be found, and my wife and son will be left over the coming years with only questions as to what happened and why. So I am recording this here. In order to understand some of the things we see in the world around us, we tend to associate what we see to what is already known in order to contextualize and understand the unknown. Very rarely do most people ever encounter something that is truly unfamiliar. In the rare cases where the truly unfamiliar is encountered, I imagine most people wrap it up in known fiction or experiences to avoid the paralyzing effect of incomprehension. Only in hindsight does the mind try to work out what actually happened, and this can lead to repression of memories and a collection of symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Part of the training in the military is preparing for the unknown by training repetitively to act in response to unpredictable circumstances. You train various scenarios so that even if the situation is incomprehensible, even if you are confused and lost, you can still act as you've been trained to act as long as there are specific psychological triggers such as incoming fire, threatening behavior, or a call for help. What I'm trying to convey to you is that what I think I saw may not be as it seemed. I've been a member of the reserves for almost 8 years, and much of that time has been spent in the engineers where whatever you want, we build it or blow it up. In June, my unit was conducting field training out of Camp Roberts. We had been on the ground for about 2 days, had spent that time replacing wire obstacles and preparing fortifications for the brigade-level assault. We were to be a major engineering asset in. Temperatures peaked a little at over 100 degrees. Shade provided by the intermittent oak trees was minimal. Wind was non-existent. The ice delivery coordinated through a civilian contractor was 2 days late. Tensions were already high, and the hard work hadn't yet begun. On the second day, we received a mission to detach about a half-dozen heavy equipment operators and our earth-moving equipment and have them drive over to Fort Hunter Liggett to assist in some digging operations. Details were vague, but they gave us enough information to build a statement of work, man-hours, equipment, fuel, and food requirements. Because the mission was so vague, I advised the commander that I'd like to go with them to make sure our guys weren't getting the runaround. He blessed off on the request as long as we were back before major operations were to begin the following week. So we set off. We linked up with a colonel from an active duty unit when we arrived. I didn't recognize his unit patch, but that was primarily a factor of my limited exposure to active duty units and didn't constitute, in itself, any sort of red flag for me at the time. However, in addition to a vaguely defined mission, it was very uncommon for a colonel to be directing traffic on 2 high-mobility engineer excavators, HMEE, and a lonely company-level executive officer. The oddities of the mission just kept adding up. The colonel gave us more details on exactly what we were doing and that there was the need for utmost secrecy. If we found anything as we conducted our operations, we were to halt operations immediately and call it up, which, again, in and of itself, did not seem strange since there are all manner of protected native artifacts in the area. We were instructed not to report the details of our activities to anyone in our chain of command other than % completion of the mission. We were also notified that statewide assets were being used for this mission, so if we needed any maintenance or equipment support, we'd get it, and there would be multiple other crews in the area running the same exact mission to cover as much ground as possible. After the briefing, we drew up a grid of the remote area we were located and put together our plan. We set up a small perimeter with triple standard concertina wire where we would bed down. As per the mission, we had been instructed to dig pits 6 feet in depth at 20-foot intervals. The only thing that made any sense as to the purpose of this was an old school search pattern. But with today's technology, you'd typically use ground penetrating radar to at least narrow the search. We never did find out why other methods weren't used, but on the fifth day of operations, one of the HMEE crews found something. The backhoe had completely penetrated the object before the operator stopped. The crew was on edge, but thankful that we hadn't probed any old munitions. I made the call and we moved the HMEE away from the pit. All of us gathered around the pit as we waited for the colonel and whoever else he was sending to arrive. What we saw was difficult to comprehend. The object, what was left undamaged anyway, was some kind of dark stone. The backhoe had shattered one face of the stone cover and damaged the other visible sides of it. It appeared to be a box of some sort, but large and still partially buried. The uncovered portion was as long as a man is tall. There appeared to be old, well-preserved rope of some kind wrapping the box. It definitely appeared to be man-made. All the visible edges appeared to be straight, and I could see an ancient knot in the rope. Shit, I kept thinking to myself. There goes my career. Lieutenant destroys a priceless native artifact. If I don't have the National Park Service all over me, it will be the Office of Historical Preservation or the Environmental Protective Agency or someone else in addition to my chain of command and the Judge Advocate General. I started running through my defense based on the mission parameters. However, the briefing was verbal. I didn't have any hard copies of the mission to fall back on. I was back to square one. It's probably time for me to get out anyway, I thought resignedly. This shit stopped being fun years ago. My train of thought stopped there as I saw what was inside the stone box. Dark hide, hairless, limbs of some sort were visible, but the proportions seemed strange. I couldn't distinguish a torso from limbs in the dirt, nor could we see a head. I wasn't really sure what it was, and I sat there for a while as my brain tried to sort out the incomprehension. It felt odd being in a state of incomprehension for so long. It was like being intoxicated and losing focus on what you're looking at right before you feel like you enter a centrifuge. A cleanup crew arrived about half an hour later. Non-military excavators and haulers. They assured us there was no health risk in our debriefing, and we were told that the mission was complete and we could go back to our unit, much to my surprise. We decided to stay and watch them secure the object to a flatbed, cover it, and drive off. We decided to take the evening to rest up before linking back up with our unit. That night, we posted a one-man rotating guard. The 0100 shift change went well. The 0300 shift change did not. I was awoken by the man responsible for the 0300 shift stating that he could not find the previous guard, Private Collins. Now, Private Collins was dutiful if somewhat inexperienced. Abandoning his post for smoke was completely out of character. I slipped on my boots, put on my blouse, and went around the perimeter with the current guard, but we couldn't find any trace of our missing soldier. We did notice an anomaly on the perimeter walk. At one section of our perimeter, the ties we used to secure the concertina wire to the pickets were removed, and the wire had been carefully untangled, as if someone had made a new entrance to our camp, broad enough for 2 people to walk through. I immediately woke everyone up and got a head count. No other soldiers were missing. I had everyone gear up, get our white light flashlights out, and turn on the floodlights on our vehicles, and we started a perimeter search outside the wire. We found Private Collins about 45 minutes later. It is hard to see someone you are responsible for fall victim to something outside of your control. If you've lost a child, you probably understand too well the feeling of nausea and faintness followed by the adrenaline, the panic, and the denial. It's harder to see someone you care for and are responsible for in the condition we found him in. Even now, when I sleep, I often dream of his faceless form screaming at me. His face was a humongous mass of bruised tissue. His skin cracked, dry and yellowed where it wasn't bruised. His uniform and undergarments were removed, folded, and placed next to the body. I called 911, range control in my chain of command. Following the incident, no one recalled hearing anything that night that would indicate a struggle. No one heard anything that would have indicated someone was testing our perimeter. No one could explain the breach in our wire. The base was locked down for a time, and we were moved to secure quarters while the sheriff's department and range control personnel asked their questions. The FBI showed up several days later. I saw the colonel again before our release, and he looked both serious and concerned. He asked his questions, but we had no more for him than we had for the others. I asked him about the object, and he looked at me coldly, his face transitioning from warm concern to emotionless professionalism, and refused to answer any of my questions. "Are we in danger?" I asked, but he left without responding to me. In the end, it was ruled a suicide, though that wouldn't come out for another few weeks. I didn't believe it then, and I know that's not the case now. By the time we were released back to our unit, the field training exercise was over and our orders were almost up. In the remaining few nights of recovery operations, we doubled the guard shifts. When I looked at the staff duty log in the morning on the first day back with the unit, I noticed several entries indicating that some rustling was detected around outside of the wire, but the guards were unable to determine the source of the noise without leaving the wire, and none deemed it necessary. Coyotes wouldn't be able to do us any harm if they couldn't get through the wire, the reasoning went. I hadn't slept much since the incident and figured my mind was assessing noises to the impossible memory of someone breaching the wire perimeter without making a sound. I was second-guessing my own senses because they failed me so completely on the night of the incident. On the last night, I decided to walk the perimeter with the guards for as long as I could before my lack of sleep caught up with me. It wasn't until about midnight that anything out of the ordinary occurred. I was standing alone, putting in a fresh pinch of dip to help stay sharp, when I heard a light shuffling in the growth beyond our perimeter. I turned my night vision goggles on and did my best to stay focused. There weren't many bushes or anything to hide behind. There was just tall grass and oaks. The shuffling stopped. My eyes refocused and caught the outline of what seemed like a stand of immature leafless oak not more than 100 feet away that I hadn't seemed to notice before. They just barely protruded from the tall grass on the reverse slope of the hill we were on. I felt a tingling run down my spine as if I was being watched, and my hand went to my rifle. Even without ammunition, the feel of the pistol grip was comforting. There must have been 8 thin branches and one thick trunk bunched together, rising about equally from the brush. The thin branches bent at odd angles, and some seemed to be connected to each other and were quivering slightly. The large trunk was absolutely still. I was mesmerized and terrified. Something seemed odd about what I was seeing. The thing slowly dipped down below the grass and disappeared. The shuffling began again and then faded into the distance. My heart rate only began to return to normal after about an hour. The following morning, when we convoyed back to our home stations, we noticed that 3 vehicles had identical damage to their doors, as if something large had forced itself in between them in the motor pool. The damage was primarily chest high and continued along the length of the vehicle. I was reminded of what I thought I saw the previous night. The leadership discussed it, and we had to report the damage to higher, as these types of events were indeed reportable. We were being watched by this point. I was sure of it, but couldn't raise my suspicions on a gut feeling, so I remained silent. We convoyed back without incident. Over the next 5 months, our unit had 5 fatalities. Each death occurred under suspicious circumstances. Each shared some key similarities. No one heard a struggle. However, evidence of rather large forced entries were evident, including shattered glass and torn drywall that even those in the same house didn't seem to hear. Each of them was a part of the dig. From various sources, a picture emerged that prior to their deaths, each man became increasingly paranoid. It started simply as thinking they saw something unusual but benign. But then after days and weeks, the sightings would build like a concerto, becoming more and more aggressive. Police would be called, but nothing but unclear tracks, damaged vehicles, and signs of forced entry could be found, but never a perpetrator. Their sanity would fray as the crescendo of unexplained activity around them reached a fevered pitch. Each of them became increasingly hostile to criticism of their mental faculties, cut themselves off from the world, their work, and their family. Then everything would stop, and some concerned neighbor or friend would decide to check on them only to find a horrific scene. Still, no one heard anything or saw anything other than the victims themselves. Each of us thought we might be next. After the second fatality, the police started posting squad cars outside the houses of the remaining soldiers, including myself, under the suspicion that this was the work of a serial killer. I sent my wife and child to stay with relatives and started stockpiling ammunition suitable for larger game. I stopped sleeping long before the last of the dig crew turned up dead, as there was really no way to tell if I was next. Needless to say, the squad cars didn't help. The killings continued. All the while, I got the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I started to think that I saw a familiar vehicle repeatedly. Low-flying helicopters cross over my property when they never had before. But what disconcerted me the most was the forest across from my property. I started seeing things out there not long ago, moving around slowly and calmly. I live in a waking dream with periods of brief lucidity. I have waking nightmares, and it has become exceedingly difficult to tell if I'm actually hearing or seeing what I think I am. I've moved into the basement and have fortified the door leading down here, as well as reinforcing the windows with planking and sheet steel. I am now sure that I've started hearing things move around upstairs over the past few nights. I can hear wood creaking, straining against a heavy weight. I don't know what we dug up, or why anyone wanted it. I'm the last man who was on that crew. I just need to stay alert. Stay alert. Stay alive. My place isn't in the boonies, but it isn't suburbia either. I can see the next nearest house from my porch, but the oaks can make it difficult to see most of the area. Since my wife and son have gone to stay with family, the baby monitor system in the house has been unused. I figured it was time to get it set up to overlook likely avenues of approach as well as key areas in my house. After the camera system was set, I kept busy by setting some of my hunting traps from last winter around my property and making sure both of my weapons had plenty of ammunition were in the basement where I needed them. I also used the primitive string and can early detection system liberally in a perimeter around my house. All this was done before nightfall with the help of one of my more open-minded friends. He offered to stay and pull watch with me, but I declined for his safety's sake. Last night was New Year's in our area. The sounds of fireworks and gunfire were both comforting in the sense that others were awake and alert in my area, but also nerve-wracking since I couldn't distinguish many of the sounds from something banging around upstairs. The winds were high and the air was cold. My property was dark. The fireworks and gunfire continued until about 12:30, and that's when I picked up the first sign of it. One string of cans had elastically released tension and jangled, and a second later my monitor picked up the feed that registered the sound. I saw the snap of the string, but not the cause of it at first. It was large and moved slowly, very slowly. It must have been the size of a large cow or buffalo, except I'm sure it weighed less as it didn't really have a large central mass. This was the first time I'd gotten a whole view on the thing. It was all limbs or branches, depending on how liberal your mindset is. It was moving slowly on all four limbs. I could clearly make out that it has 4 limbs, not 8 as I had previously believed. Its limbs were long, very long. It would periodically stop, and if I hadn't known what to look for, I would have thought it was a small set of saplings. Its limbs even wavered slightly with the wind as if to mimic a tree. I couldn't see a head or eyes, but the central trunk was larger than the rest of it and remained stiff. I couldn't make out any textures as it was about 30 feet from the first feed. As it moved, I saw it deliberately step over my hunting traps as it moved out of the vision field of my first feed and into that of my second. It kept its slow, deliberate pace. One of its limbs became entangled on another string of cans before freeing itself. It started climbing the porch and froze. Its central trunk turned from its direction of movement towards the nearest camera in an eerily smooth motion and froze. Its limbs didn't quiver. It wasn't trying to pretend. One limb raised and gripped the door somehow, pulling in a slow, smooth motion as the door was peeled off the frame. It deliberately and slowly placed the unhinged door aside while making no noise that my camera's microphone could pick up. Then its trunk turned back in the direction of movement and kept moving into the house. As it moved into the front door, I could see the frame bend and could hear the wood creak and taper off into a long, deep moan as the thing forced its way slowly into my home. One of the house feeds picked it up as it moved from room to room. It was probing. It got to the door down to the basement and stopped. It froze like it did before. No quivering, no movement whatsoever. It looked so monstrously out of place in the man-made environment, which only made me more fearful of it. I must have watched it for an hour by this time, and I continued to watch it frozen there. I drank an entire thermos of coffee, which I had brewed earlier while I waited, and used empty water bottles to relieve myself as we had done in Iraq. I was torn. Should I go up to the top of the steps and put a few rounds through the door, or would that just bring its cold fury down upon me as I imagined how it would peel the door open and force itself down into my basement, with nowhere for me to go? I opted to wait it out as much out of fear as out of practicality. It stood there immobile until 0400 when it began to move towards the porch. By 0430 it was halfway across my driveway, moving towards the tree line. My nerves were shot. My adrenaline rush had nearly left me. I was over-caffeinated and exhausted. I decided to see how fast it could move. I checked both my Mossberg shotgun and my civilian M4 223. Both were loaded, the shotgun with alternating slugs and double-aught buckshot. I had my body armor on for whatever good that would do, and my combat sling so I could switch quickly over to my M4 when my shotgun's tube magazine was empty. I paused and watched through the monitor as it slowly and methodically crawled towards the tree line opposite my property. I had one last thing to check before I went out. Any experienced shooter needs to know what is beyond their target to avoid collateral damage, but with where it was and where it was going, there would be no risk of impacting my neighbors' homes or an unlikely passerby if I missed my target. I took 3 deep breaths. Slow as smooth, smooth as fast. I threw on the floodlights and ran up the stairs as quickly as possible. My boots caused a thick, hearty pounding sound with each step up the stout staircase that sounded like artillery, while my heart had the rhythmic, overwhelming rumble of a freight train. I reached my front porch and barely caught a glimpse of it moving into the tree line about 70 feet away, and it was making almost no noise. It was still in effective range of my primary weapon. I fired 3 shots, slug, buckshot, slug, and it was gone. There was no question. It could move incredibly fast when it needed to. It must have covered almost 40 feet in the few seconds it took me to get up the stairs, across the hall into my porch. That'd make it at least as fast as a man. I scanned the perimeter a few times and saw nothing. If I hit it, it made no noise. I ran back inside when courage drained from me and went back to the basement. I locked and braced the door. My son, my son, my son, was all I thought over and over as I bathed in the jubilation of being alive. I would see my son again. I got a call from my slightly drunk neighbor about then, asking what happened and if he needed to call the cops. I assured him it was just some coyotes that were getting bold. After sitting down in the far corner of my basement to gather my wits, with the light of the monitor flickering on my face, my adrenaline must have completely worn off. I blacked out. I woke this morning and went to take a look, still armed of course, at where I last saw it. I found a couple points on trees where buckshot impacted, but could not find where the slugs hid. I didn't find any blood, but I did find shattered bark and some brown leathery material. Not much, mind you. Maybe a fistful? It looked to have been torn violently from whatever it came from. I took some solace from the assumption that at least I hit it. I walked the perimeter where it went and found one of the strings of cans torn from its place. One of my snares was gone. I assumed it tripped the snare in the rush out. And I saw what kind of track it left as it moved. didn't resemble anything I've ever hunted. All that was left were individual circular depressions with a set of two small, slightly deeper impressions that may have been claws or fingers of some sort. I don't know why it ran. It dispatched the others with ease, though I don't remember any of the other cases involving gunfire. I'm not sure if the next time it won't just turn around and do what it came to do. Does it suffer surprise and panic as we do? Or was it something else? I felt like it was still watching me, waiting, craving something I can't directly give it. It probably wasn't far, swaying in the breeze and waiting with perfect and inhuman patience. I will see what can be done. As a last resort, I still have plenty of gasoline. I looked at my watch. Still plenty of daylight left. I had more work to do. It's been months since the consequences of the dig were made clear. I have been completely occupied in the intervening period by a new sense of purpose and a new set of duties, so I apologize for this delay. Unfortunately, I have few concrete answers regarding its nature. Even in the face of the unknown, I have had to move forward and continue with the mission as I was trained to. For now, I can only convey what happened after I shot it as it made off into the forest. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, I did push-ups in my basement to keep my heart rate up, stay focused, and keep the effects of sleep deprivation at bay. It had been a long 6 months of restless sleep until it came into my home the first time. Since then, I had only gotten short stretches in an hour here, a couple hours there. Survival is a powerful motivator for anyone, but there is only so much the human body can take. I listened intently as a light breeze rustled the trees outside. I could hear the wind breathe vigorously over the paneling outside, the creaking of my house as the temperature dropped, and the knocking of wood joints in my walls as they adjusted to the rapidly changing environment. The knocking reverberated through the empty spaces of my home like a stranger asking to come in but unable to find a door. It never made any noise that I could discern outside of a shuffling in thick brush. It was quiet, whether it was peeling a door off its frame or running at a sprint over the gravel of my driveway into the tree line. By all accounts, in a man's final moments of life, it is still completely silent, as it goes to work on them, breaking bone, bruising flesh, and causing fatal hemorrhaging. All of this before silently preparing or desecrating the corpse in the way a mortician might, while cleaning the body before leaving as silently as it came. No, the only noise it ever made was getting caught in transparent fishing line in the black of night. How do you face something like that? I could smell my own desperation as the accelerant had soaked into the carpet of my first floor rooms, strong, sharp, and unmistakable. I could recount my hopelessness as I had finished boarding all but one small basement window and bracing the doors. My helplessness was clear when I had turned on my oven's gas and routed the switch and wiring for my Viking barbecue's igniter through the wall and down into my basement. I waited as the sun went down and the noise of the house and the wind outside died to a murmur. Nature herself seemed too afraid to speak. I waited and watched the monitor and cameras I had set up the previous day, listening for signs that it was here. It was dull work, and as the hours stretched on, my focus began to slip. I must have dozed off. The monitor picked up a creak of floorboards at the entryway. My eyes shot open, and I took an involuntary deep breath in my panic. My eyes focused, and there it was, moving slowly, swaying slightly, and making its way through the front doorway, which had been peeled bare on its previous incursion. It was large as a bison, perhaps. It was so large it seemed as if it had to deform to squeeze into my home once again. Its joints bent at odd angles, its skin taut over its nebulous frame, knobby joints and disturbingly long limbs that looked like branches with their asymmetric bends, short offshoots, and faux foliage. It had no face, but it moved with perfect awareness. However it perceived its surroundings, it was not blind. I got the impression it couldn't smell the environment it was entering. Either I was getting lucky, or this was all a futile exercise indeed. I whispered a prayer. The floorboards creaked under its weight as it went directly for the door leading to my basement. It knew where I was, so there was no need for it to search the house as it had before. Its pace slowed as it approached the door. On the monitor, it moved as serenely as a boat does across the water after the thrust has been cut. Its leaves caressed the walls as it went, contrasting with the damage its limbs left as they peeled away drywall, wallpaper, and family photos. It came to a stop at the foot of the door. It waited there for over an hour. I did not know why it did this. It seemed perfectly capable of ending the game it was playing at any time, but for some reason let it play out like some sort of ritual. I checked my watch and knew the time was almost upon us. I crept slowly back towards the only window that was not boarded up, slowly unlatched it and pushed it open. I slid my rifle out with a satchel of ammunition. Then I slid my shotgun out, knowing that this would be my most vulnerable moment. It was then that I depressed the igniter switch and secured it with tape in one quick swipe. Nothing happened. It only took a second for me to lose focus on the monitor, but as my eyes crept over to it, I saw the thing move. It sprawled its aft limbs back impossibly fast as I heard them dig into the floorboards, ruining the fine polish I had applied the summer before. Its forelimbs shot out in a smooth mechanical motion and gripped something out of frame that could only have been the top edge of the door. I heard a sharp tear of yielding steel and aluminum, followed by the crackle of splintering wood. Time slowed, and I took a running dive that got me halfway out the window. I clawed at the dirt and threw my hips one side and then the other to squeeze out the window. The cold air hit me in waves. I never felt so helpless or as slow as my hands and forearms dug into the dirt and brush. I heard the echo of the door being thrown aside in my house, crashing through picture frames and drywall. I heard it clamber down the stairs as it pushed through haphazardly placed junk, meant to slow it down, but doing no such thing. My feet cleared the window, and I kicked off the wall, giving me a precious few inches of distance from the building. Rolling and grabbing my rifle, I came up to a sloppy kneeling position as I saw it crash into the window. Cracks ran through the ancient brick foundation on its impact, but it couldn't fit through such a small space. One of its limbs shot out from me, but I was out of reach. This was only a temporary respite. It seemed to stare at me for just a second, though there were no eyes and no mouth. A section of its flat torso seemed to peer out of the window as its arms clawed at me in frustrated rage. It had no eyes, so it couldn't see as we do. Nonetheless, I felt its attention on me. I came back to myself over the momentary confusion of incomprehension. When it turned around, it could make its way up the stairs and work its way out of the house before I could really go anywhere. This was it. I was done. All that was left was what I was trained to do. I raised my rifle and started firing through the window. I lost count of the rounds, but my bolt locked to the rear, gripped the next magazine, an index finger depression and a flick of the wrist to release the emptied one, slap the next one in, release the catch, and I'm back in the fight. Slow as smooth, smooth as fast. As my bolt slammed forward, I saw an orange glow building behind the window and noticed the thing wasn't going back up the stairs. Rather, it was trying to come through the basement window to escape the building inferno. The back pressure caused glass panes to shatter, and smoke started pouring out of the partially obstructed windows. Several seconds, or minutes, or weeks later, and I was out of ammunition. 5 empty magazines lay in the dirt, and 1 empty one in my rifle, but it wasn't dead. It was still trying to escape as an orange glow started to build behind it, and smoke poured out of the basement window as its arms frantically shot out, seeking something to help it escape the brick and earth prison, or to pull me inside. The Mossberg was in my hands from somewhere, though I couldn't recall picking it up. Weapon up, back in the fight. My ears were ringing as my house disappeared into a pier. When the basement collapsed, its struggle ceased. I was holding an empty shotgun when the fire department arrived, and they kept their distance. We all let the fire slowly die and the wreckage smolder as there was nothing else to be done. I couldn't afford to do the cleanup myself and thought it better to leave the ruin, its tomb as it was. I would probably need to sell the land at some point, just not yet. I holed up in a hotel over the next few days. I hadn't filed an insurance claim for obvious reasons, so this was all out of pocket. My savings account was draining quickly to the frustrated protest of my wife, who wanted me to stay with her and my son. I couldn't risk it, however, not with its memory still fresh. After 3 days, I received a call. It was the colonel. He wanted to drop by. The colonel pulled up in a black four-door SUV. As I stepped out of the front door of my hotel room, I could see other faces in the SUV, but none made a move to exit the vehicle as it came to a stop. The colonel got out of the passenger side, and I could see he was now in civilian attire and unarmed. The look on his face made it clear that I looked like shit, but he didn't seem surprised. He walked over, his boots kissing the gravel in the parking lot. "How are you doing?" he asked. I paused and licked my lips. He could obviously see how I was doing. I had bags under my eyes, I was haggard, and I was angry. "Sir, you didn't give me an answer before, but you knew something was wrong. The last time I saw you, your expression said it all. Need to know only was what your face said, and I apparently didn't have a need to know." I trailed off. "Yes." He looked sad as he paused and took a deep breath. "Yes, you need to understand that we are in a sensitive line of work." I lost it. "Sensitive line of work?" I shouted. "There was something out there that you knew was dangerous, but you didn't warn us. Now 5 of my guys are dead, and my home is gone." "And in that line of work," he continued unfazed, "sometimes you only get one chance to accomplish the mission, and it costs lives. I know that, and it never gets any easier, but that's what we do. Even by withholding information, it's as if I'm pulling the trigger myself. I know that." There was silence between us for a while as I waited for him to continue and explain why he had to withhold information from us. He didn't. The silence dragged on in the same way they teach cops and salesmen do, to get people to talk and give up valuable information. Only I didn't have any information to give. "Sir, what do you want from me?" And so he told me. They had been watching those of us on the dig for some time, waiting to see what would happen. After the first death, additional resources were allocated to try to understand this thing's intent, its natures, its strength and weaknesses. They had air assets, satellite assets, manpower, and the authority to use them all. They were a part of JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, and nationally operated under the intelligence sections. As I asked additional questions, things became a little fuzzy. Their mission was to identify and neutralize asymmetric threats to American interests, but details on what specific threats they dealt with were sparse. Terrorist cells? Not exactly. That's for the line units, Delta, DEV, GRU, and the like, the colonel replied. Then what? "What is it that you encountered last night?" the colonel asked. I hadn't told him about what had happened. They were watching me, apparently, and so they would have seen it all. I paused for a while. "I don't really know." "That's exactly the kind of threat we seek out. That's the kind of threat we seek to understand and neutralize." He paused. "Or use." He stopped there, not disclosing anything substantial, but teasing me with partial answers. I was curious. I was very curious. I wanted to know what I had been marked by, what it was, how they knew about it. But I also needed to focus on the 50-meter target in colloquial terms. Back to my original question. What do you want? "We watched 5 men go mad before the thing ever got to them. When they saw it directly, their sanity began to fray. They would isolate themselves as much as possible. Their senses degraded, their judgment became poorer and poorer. At some point they gave up and lost sight of the bigger picture. You held on longer than the rest. You engaged it, and you remained among the living. Of course we will want to put you through a psych eval. You'd need additional training to be sure, but you have the basics. Combat arms experience, leadership experience. Your evaluation reports are exemplary." I had no idea where he was going with this. "Think of this as a recruitment pitch, though in all honesty, we wouldn't typically reach out to someone who is otherwise as," he paused slightly, choosing his words, "mediocre as you are, but your encounter with it has tipped the scales in your favor." "Barely." He looked at me sternly, letting me know I wasn't really worthy of the offer under any other set of circumstances. We talked about the mundane details, hazard pay, housing allowance, signing bonus. I pushed back a little. I was in good shape, but I had a few injuries that I was sure would wash me out of the challenging courses typically required for operators. Ranger school, SF school, and the like. Apparently what they did wasn't as much focused on the physical, but more the mental and psychological. In the end, I agreed to go through the Heathrow unknown schools to see if I could cut it. Before we moved forward, however, I needed to know why. Why we were left as bait, and why they didn't try to intervene. Surely they could have. Sir, this is fine and all, but why did my guys have to die? Why couldn't you have done anything? He looked at me and chewed his lip. I suppose we could have helped. There's no reason that will make you feel like the lives of your men were worth it. We didn't know for sure what it was going to do because we were working off of legends. We didn't know what it was capable of or if we could use it. We had to let it be to learn as much as possible. In the end, it seems it wasn't as resilient as we thought, but we have excellent data on it in case we run across it again. Strength, speed, durability, hunting strategy, preferred biovac environments, susceptibility to fire. It didn't lend itself to capture, but this information could save lives as well. That's really the best we can give you. If it had killed you, we would have continued to track it and study it. Information like this is simply invaluable. Is it over then? You use the past tense. Is it dead? I can't answer the latter part of your question with any certainty. As I said, we deal with a lot of unknowns. What I can say is a generous offer will be made on your land, and the site will be properly secured. You won't have to worry about it coming after you again. He looked me in the eyes. You will come across these situations where innocents die, where soldiers die as part of the mission. It will be your call that leads them to their fate, but you will need to make tough decisions for the safety of us all, provided you pass the requisite training evaluations. I looked him in the eyes while swallowing my cold anger. I would bide my time while I came to grips with what even I could admit was incomprehension. I would learn as much as I could about this organization, its intent and purposes. I would carry on with the mission for now until I could determine what kind of threat this type of organization really was to not only my fellow soldiers and the people we protect, but to the ideals we served. I will, I repeated sternly. I will.